Hi, my name is Kevin Duffey. I'm a solution engineer here at TIBCO. I have over 4 years of experience working on SAP S4 transformation projects and data management. So today I'm going to walk you through a solution we put together that focuses on this SAP S4 transformation process and how we're going to help with that process through this digital decoupling approach. So here's our disclaimer slide, just mentioning everything is subject to change. Okay, so before we actually get into the solution, I first want to walk through the use case and just make sure that we're all aligned as to what we're going to be talking about today. So the focus here today is actually on the master data migration portion of the project. So this is really one of the first steps that takes place within an S4 transformation. You need to get your master data to the target system before you're actually able to start transacting on it and creating new purchase orders or sales orders, whatever processes you have in that target system. So lots of times companies struggle with this since there's always a lot of variations between their current IT landscape. They might have 2 ECC instances, a Salesforce instance, Oracle. All these types of systems need to at times combine together when we're transforming to an S4 landscape. This is a great time to reinvent your processes and reduce your different complexities of multiple systems having to interact. So the focus here today actually is going to be on the customer and vendor master data domains. The reason we're going to start with these domains as a good example is because companies struggle lots of times with migrating these domains to an S4 system because there's a new concept that's introduced known as CVI, which stands for customer vendor integration. What actually happens during this customer vendor integration is we're introducing a new data model known as business partner, where every customer and vendor has to also get created as a business partner. So some of the complexities that are introduced are we have to populate new tables that aren't existing in your legacy systems. New fields are introduced, different mappings that have to occur from your legacy systems to your target systems. New validation checks are going to exist with these business partners in S4. So in order for us to get this vendor and customer master data to this target S4 system, we need to make sure all the data is formatted correctly in these legacy ECC systems so that it can be migrated successfully. Lots of times people will start trying to push the data into the target system unknowingly if it's going to migrate successfully. So we're going to put together a solution that's going to tell you up front if this data will migrate successfully. So one other point to mention here is that when we have a solution that tells you upfront, we're going to put this all into a dashboard. These different analytics are going to go into a dashboard to tell all the different project teams, whether that's procurement or your sales and services teams. We're going to be able to summarize all the different aspects of your customer and vendor data and which different areas within that data has issues. So all the teams can collaborate and look into different areas of this migration project. So now I'm going to get into the actual steps that are involved in this solution that we're going to demonstrate shortly here. So the first step is we want to decouple your data sources. So as you can see at the bottom, we have an ECC1, ECC2, and a Salesforce. All these different instances have data all over the place. We need to get a unified view of all your vendor data across your legacy systems. Regardless of your current landscape, the good thing about the solution is it can support however many data sources and a magnitude of multiple different types of data sources, whether that's Excel, Oracle, S4, Salesforce, etc. So again, we need to start getting all this data in a manner that we can identify what it would look like if we were to migrate at any point in time. So once we get this unified list of data through this digital layer, let's start profiling it, and it can tell you what volume of data you're actually going to need to migrate to this S4 instance. So looking at vendors, for example, which vendor records are being used, which vendor fields are being used, and which ones are unused? What's the activity that's occurring on these vendor records? So for instance, do we have purchase orders in the past 2 years that have transacted on these vendors or not? If that's not the case, maybe we can exclude those from the migration because they're becoming irrelevant. So the next part is our violations, right? So let's start looking at, as I mentioned earlier, we have different validation checks that are occurring in our S4 instance. The validation checks could also be different. So we need to start looking at our current data and start trying to identify where all these issues exist so that we can start actually remediating them and cleansing them. So when it comes down to the last second and we're trying to do an S4 cutover, it's not all of a sudden identified at that point. We want to get ahead of the game, and right once we start this project, start identifying all the different violations that are existing, so we know the sheer level of effort that's required to fix these issues and actually get the data to the next system. So some examples here actually are your bank account information, your tax IDs, your actual IDs on the records. So these are all types of things that we need to check the formatting and check if your IDs, if your vendor ID also has the same vendor ID in another system, or the customer's IDs are the same as the vendor ID. Since we're trying to create all these records into one system, we need to start looking at those types of checks. So once we've identified those violations, we can actually start cleansing the data. As I was just mentioning, we want to get ahead of the game and start getting people to remediate these issues so that it's not a last second apparent item that comes up that we need to fix, right? So the other thing that we brought into the solution is machine learning, actually. So what we brought in is we're able to predict what the cleanse or the violation should be cleansed to, right? So for instance, if you have a country code that's missing on your vendor, we can predict what that country code should be updated to based off your entire data set. So looking at the postal codes, looking at street addresses. This is just one example that can be utilized across your entire data set on all your fields. So now that we've started getting ahead of the process, S4 wasn't even introduced yet. So we've already started getting ready for this migration. So now that we have actually introduced S4 and set it up, now we can actually have the SMEs start working on configuring S4, looking to see if the company code 001 and ECC instance 1 should be configured in S4. If maybe there's a company code in your first ECC instance 002 that should actually be mapped to 001 in your target system because you're consolidating all your different company codes, right? So this takes a long process, but what we're going to do is we're going to start doing iterations actually through this process of cleansing and then configuring and then finding where there's actual misalignments between that configuration of your source systems and your target systems, and remediating that configuration, fixing it. Once we start identifying this through this analytics engine and dashboard, we can point out at any point in time from actually real-time data that's being pulled directly from these sources. And we're actually not going through an ETL process. So this is all looking directly into the sources. So at any point in time, we can look at the amount of misalignments we have from these source systems to your target systems, and then look at if there's any sort of issues with this cross-reference mappings, and get the full report out to give to your project managers so they know the level of effort that's required before we actually have to start migrating the data. Okay, so now I want to switch over to the actual demonstration. Now here what you're looking at is our dashboard landing page, where we have 3 different dashboards that roll up under here. And these all sort of correlate to what I was just walking you through, where we have first, we want to start profiling the data as is today to determine the amount of data that should be migrated. So we can get an idea as to the number of records, the number of fields, and get an idea as to like what needs to be migrated, right? So the second one actually is where now we're at a point in time, let's start looking at the violations that exist within this data and determine how we can start fixing it. And then the last one's when S4 actually is taken into consideration. We've actually stood up S4 and we're starting to compare that legacy data to the S4 data. So I'll go ahead and go into the first dashboard here. So what you see here is, as I was mentioning, this profiling piece, right? So at the top of the page, you'll notice there's our total account on ECC vendors, total account on ECC customers, and even Salesforce accounts we brought in. So these are all coming from sandbox types instances. So the numbers are kind of low, but this is all coming through that digital layer where we're actually creating unions on multiple different ECC systems. As you remember on that last page, I had 2 ECC instances that we're unionizing the vendor data together. So you can see here, we have the counts per system. I'm going to quickly move over to the back-end digital decoupling layer here, where we're actually going to show some of these different queries that we have. So you can see here, before we even get into the queries, we can look at the data sources. All we should do is put in the system properties and we can get the table structures behind all these different instances. So for instance, we can get the LFA1 table is the vendor master, right? So all these tables will pop up and we can select which ones we want to include in here. And then even taking it to the next level, we can also introduce security profiles to restrict which tables users have access to based off of the security structure. If there's any sort of data sensitivity, then we can restrict people from looking at particular areas. So this here is just an example of how we brought in the customer data from one ECC source, customer data from an S4 source, and customer data from a Salesforce source, actually account data, for instance. So this is just an aggregate of all these different sources getting combined in a way. So the next view I'm going to take you to is actually more of a lineage type view. So this will show you that same type of query I was looking at a second ago, but the lineage behind it. So where did this data come from? How is it getting combined? So if we have a complex query, we can really backtrack to look at the lineage of this data. So I wanted to quickly pop in there to get an idea as to where this is coming from, right? So let me now go into some of these different use cases around profiling and give you an idea as to the benefits of doing this process here. So now we're looking at vendors, for instance, so that now we get an idea as to the amount of records that maybe we might want to migrate. But what really makes sense is to start looking at purchase order history, the amount of records that are marked for deletion. We don't want to migrate irrelevant data to a new system. If we're starting from scratch in a new system, this is a chance to really improve your data quality and not bring over irrelevant data. So you can see here, we actually have 414 records that do have a PO in the past 2 years, and then 2,248 of your records don't. So this is really significantly cutting down the amount of records that we need to take into consideration for this migration, right? This might be a little not as accurate as you might think for your business environment, since most companies might actually have more vendors that have had POs on them. But this, again, is coming from a sandboxing environment to give you an idea. The next piece here, we're actually looking at duplicates. So lots of times this is a great opportunity, as I just mentioned, to improve that data quality, deduplicate your data. So you can see here, out of the 2,716 vendors, we've identified 563 duplicates, where 483 of them exist within the first ECC instance, and then 80 of them exist in the second ECC instance. So we're also brought in an engine to identify duplicates within this data. So you see here, I'll select on the first instance. These are all the similar records that pop up that could be potential duplicates. And we should have your data stewards look through this data to determine if they can be deduplicated before we migrate the data. So again, this is another level of effort estimate up front that we want to start looking at so that we can determine if this is something we can do. Lots of times companies won't look at this deduplication process till we've already got halfway through this S4 project, and then it gets descoped and we're putting bad data into the new environment. So another piece here, vendor account group, right? So vendor account groups are a really important way to classify your vendor data. Some account groups might become irrelevant over time and you don't need to include them in your migration. So another good way to segregate which data you should be migrating. We can also look around the globe and see where your data is residing, if it's the majority of it's in the US or different countries. Another important piece to look into is your creations over time. So if we're going through a year-long project, maybe it's a good time to start evaluating what's the amount of new records that'll get created in the next year. So we can kind of get an idea as to maybe looks like about 50 or so that have been created in the last year, customers, 50 or so vendors. So that's about what we can expect as a delta between this point in time and when we actually do the cutover. So then from here on out, we can also track which new records are getting added into this population. Lastly, we have these profiling metadata results on our vendor master is one good example here. We can look at the minimum length, maximum length. Some other examples are uniqueness, if the field is empty or not. So we want to start looking at these types of things to determine if we need to actually go through a detailed process of evaluating the field's data. So if the field's empty, we can exclude that field from our scope of migration and not even have to really consider looking at standardizing that data and things like that. So I'll go back to the main screen. We've gone over this profiling piece. Now I want to get into the actual violations, right? So with our focus on the business partner CVI process with our customer vendor data, as I've mentioned during the earlier piece of this demonstration, we really need to focus on the data formatting of particular fields within these customer and vendor records. So what we have here is our entire population of vendor records. We are looking at the percentage of them that don't actually have a violation identified based off this analytics engine. And then the percent, I guess 26.8% we've identified do have some sort of violation. So we've broken that up even per system, since we're bringing in both systems data. And then from there, we're breaking it up and classifying the violation type that's been identified. So there's violation types such as your bank account needs to be formatted correctly. The length of it needs to be a certain length per country. That's where this whole process gets so difficult, is that each country has its unique standards for how long the bank account record or field value should be, how many digits, how many hyphens, where the hyphens are in order. So these are all types of things that we need to start looking at to making sure that everything's formatted between all your source systems correctly. Another thing, country code's a mandatory field. One of our source systems didn't have it as mandatory, but in S4 it's going to be mandatory. So if that field value is not populated, when we try to push that record from your ECC instance to your S4 instance, it's actually going to cause a failure. And again, so what we're doing here is looking for all these failure points now, fixing them instead of trying to push the data and then identifying them in a reactive manner instead of a proactive manner. Same thing, again, I'm not going to go too in depth with all these, but email addresses need to be formatted. As I mentioned before, your customer and vendor IDs need to have either separate IDs or we need to create the business partners under a new number range or assign new IDs for them, because we can't have two business partners with the same ID. Phone number, again, needs formatting correctly. It's the same thing with postal codes and tax codes. Tax codes are one of the biggest pain points for this conversion to business partner, because same thing I mentioned with bank accounts, but we have 5 different tax fields that all need to be standardized in a particular way per country. So it brings in lots of different area points you need to look into. So this next piece here, we have some of the different subsets of violations that you just saw falling under, so we can scroll down into each one and really navigate through here effectively. So looking into the customer vendor ID overlap, this is what I was just mentioning. Looks like we have 1.4% of our customers and vendors where they have the same ID. So now we can start looking at these, the names of these records to determine if they're the same legal entity or not. If they are the same legal entity, maybe they're created as the same business partner, since a business partner can actually have a customer and a vendor record that are under it. So they could be the same legal entity, so then we create them as one business partner. This is another business decision that needs to be taken place. If some companies decide not to go that route and not to have a customer and vendor record created as one business partner. Again, the ID assignment whole process has to take place to determine what number ranges you get assigned in your S4 system. So we need to start looking at these types of things, right? So next I'm going to go into these company code violations where we need every vendor to have a country code populated on the record. And if there's not a country code populated on the record will not migrate because this field is actually mandatory in S4. So what we're going to do is, this is where we're going to incorporate some machine learning to help predict what the missing value should be populated as. So here I'll go ahead and select this input missing data icon we have here, where this is calling the machine learning engine in the background to help analyze the different data attributes across our data set and determine what this country code ID field should be updated to. So here we've gotten a result, and I'm going to take an example such as Seattle wire steel. So this vendor here, search for it in our other data set that hasn't been edited based off machine learning. And now you can see here on the existing data that is in our ECC1 instance doesn't have a vendor country code ID populated on it. So from here, now what we're doing is we're predicting what this value should be updated to so that we can export this list and provide it to your data stewards, for instance. So then now it's just more of a review process instead of a due diligence process. So you'll see here, we can actually look at this record to make sure that the engine predicted the correct value. So if we look at the vendor's name is Seattle Wire Steel, the city Seattle, the King, it's in King County, I'm guessing, in Washington region. So we can confirm that the value of US is actually an accurate value, and then we will go ahead and update this in the source system. So the last violation check I'll walk you through are these tax codes. As I was mentioning above, the tax codes are really complicated. As you can see, there's 4 fields here that tax codes can all be populated in for different purposes. For instance, US has social security numbers and an EIN number. So social security number goes in one of the fields and EIN goes in the other field. And both of these have to be formatted in a particular way based off the country. So what we're doing here is getting a holistic view into your entire list of vendors per country, and then if they're which tax fields populated for them. As you can see, looks like for Brazil, we have multiple instances where different tax fields are used. So now we'll have to go through here to determine which tax fields are formatted correctly. And we've actually brought in an engine to help you determine that. So now from here, we can actually pick out which ones have invalid formatting and really have to start remediating these records and at least point the data stewards into the direction that they need to start looking into. So now I'm going to go back to the introduction. So this is the last piece I'm going to show here where we have the comparison of S4 and ECC, specifically on ECC master data, if it aligns to what's configured in S4. This is where lots of migration failures will occur because you try to push, let's say, a vendor that's extended to the company code 001, but that company code hasn't been configured in S4 for whatever reason, or there's not a mapping in place where, let's say, the vendor actually is, or the new company code and the new system should be 002 for the company code 001 in the source system. So there needs to be a mapping in place. Lots of times these complex IT transformation projects require a mapping to be in place so that 1, for the data migration process, and then 2, for an ongoing process. Lots of times we have both legacy systems and your new S4 system in place, and we have to maintain data in both places until we sunset those legacy systems. So we need to have the mappings of IDs or values in place. So here, looking at some of the 3 critical different configuration items that occur for vendors and customers are account groups, country codes, company codes. So we need to make sure, as I was just mentioning, those values, those company codes are mapped between each system. As you can see for the account group, it looks like about 39.5% of the account groups that have been configured between both of our source systems are also configured in the S4 system. So either the mapping isn't fully completed or S4 isn't fully configured. So this is when we need to start looking at either 1, telling the subject matter experts to finish the configuration, or 2, let's start looking at the data. Maybe this will determine why. So now this is the point where we're actually comparing the ECC master data to the configuration in S4. So we're breaking this up per account of vendors per account group, and then also taking into consideration the account group that's been configured or hasn't been configured in S4. So this column here does not exist, means that the account group has not been configured in S4. So all the ones that exist means the account group has been configured. We don't have any issue there. Now we can take it a step farther and seeing, is the vendor active or non-active? So as I showed at the first profiling dashboard, the purchase orders on the vendors can really tell us if we should migrate them or not. If there's not any purchase orders, maybe there's no invoices. If there's no activity on that vendor or it's marked for deletion, then we shouldn't even take it into consideration into this whole process. So that's really where we can get narrowed down into the ones that are active. You can see here it's also broken up in this chart. So I'm going to highlight this chart and it's going to tell us these are the areas that we need to look into, all these records here. So are they irrelevant actually, and we're not going to migrate them so we can take them out of the scope? Or is this account group missing in the configuration for S4, and we need to tell someone to go configure that so this ties out? So at the end of the day, we should have this tie out to 100%, and that'll tell us when we can migrate. So I'm going to take it back one last step into this whole digital decoupling layer and just show one more feature that can help in the solution. So not only are we able to look into, get views into this analytics solution, but if we actually need to push the data out of the solution, we also have that ability through this API generator in this digital decoupling tool. So as you can see that last view, now I have a JSON message that's actually been generated. And now I can take that into just a browser just to demonstrate this. see that it'll actually generate a web service message that can be consumed by your S4 system or your ECC system. So this can also help with the transport of data, not only just the analysis of data. Thank you, and that'll conclude it.